vážené kolegyně, vážení kolegové, milé divačky a diváci našeho online přenosu, dovolte mi, abych vás z pozice současného předsedy České asociace orální historie co nejsrdečněji přivítal na naší v pořadí již 7. asociační konferenci s mezinárodním přesahem, kterou pořádáme tentokrát ve spolupráci s Ústavem pro soudobé dějiny Akademie věd České republiky a Fakultou humanitních studií Univerzity Karlovy. Na úvod bych moc rád poděkoval fakultě, především pak paní děkance, za poskytnutí prostor pro konání této konference i za potřebné technické zázemí pro zajištění přenosu, což nám významně tedy usnadnilo vůbec realizaci celé konference. Současně si myslím, že jde o jednu z historicky prvních konferencí vůbec, která se koná zde v nové budově fakulty v Troji. Takže jsme skutečně moc rádi, nebo je nám velkou ctí, že můžeme být jedni z prvních, kteří tady pořádají nějakou vědeckou akci. Mluvíme o Fakultě humanitních studií, tak bohužel nemohu nezmínit tedy smutnou zprávu, která nás všechny zastihla začátkem tohoto týdne. Chtěl bych proto asi využít téhle příležitosti k tomu, abychom uctili památku pana profesora Jana Sokola. V jehož osobě tedy fakulta nestratila jenom jednoho ze svých zakladatelů a svého prvního děkana, ale osobně si myslím, že také jednu z nejvýraznějších tváří, tedy ať už fakulty nebo možná i celé univerzity. S tím, že za mnohému vděčí i náš navazující magisterský obor orální historie soudobé dějiny, který mohl na této fakultě vzniknout právě díky jeho vstřícnosti v době jeho děkanátu. A proto teda bychom mu nyní věnovali minutu ticha. Děkuji. Tak naše letošní konference má podtitul Orální historie v čase krizí. Jejím hlavním záměrem je reflektovat tedy především nové situace, metodologické posuny a etická dilemata, která do orálního historického výzkumu v posledním roce vnesla právě pandemie koronaviru, která se tedy asi dotkla všech nebo každého z nás. Během dneška a zítřka tak máme možnost tedy aspoň v této hybridní podobě vyslechnout si a shlédnout téměř teda 30 příspěvků, které ve většině případů spojuje právě kromě COVID-19 snaha uskutečnit výzkum v nějakých, můžeme říci, nestandardních, a přímo krizových podmínkách. Ještě než předám tady slovo dalším řečníkům, tak bych se ještě krátce zmínil k formátu této konference. My jsme samozřejmě zvažovali různé možnosti, nakonec vzhledem k té nepříznivé epidemiologické situaci, která tedy nadále trvá, jsme zvolili ten hybridní formát konference, to znamená, část řečníků je přítomna tady osobně, bude se v téhle místnosti v rámci jednotlivých panelů střídat, zatímco ti zbývající vystupující se připojí vzdáleně a své příspěvky tedy přednesou online. Bohužel v současné situaci ta možnost auditoria není možná, takže pokud budete mít jakékoliv dotazy k těm jednotlivým příspěvkům, můžete je pokládat online, a to prostřednictvím komentářů na YouTube, kde je tedy celá konference streamována a kde bude také následně k dispozici k dalšímu zpětnému shlédnutí. Toliko tedy asi k organizačním záležitostem, držme si palce, aby nás dnes nepotkaly nějaké technické komplikace. A teď už bych předal slovo našemu čestnému předsedovi, současně garantovi navazujícího magisterského oboru orální historie soudobé dějiny na této fakultě a v neposlední řadě též současnému řediteli Ústavu pro soudobé dějiny Akademie České republiky, profesoru Miroslavu Vaňkovi.
Tak, děkuji, Jiří. Já bych nejdřív chtěl poděkovat rovněž, a to především tobě jako stávajícímu předsedovi České asociace orální historie, potom Janě, která to tady i s tebou a potom i s Lucí tady se snažili zaopatřit v těchto těžkých podmínkách, které já si myslím, že orálním historikům a historičkám moc nesvědčí. Jsme lidé, kteří potřebujeme, jsme dotykoví, potřebujeme se vidět, slyšet, vidět si nejenom oči, ale i tvář, úsměv, každé to gesto, které z nás plyne. Je to svízelné pro nás, ale vypořádáme se s tím, jako jsme se koneckonců vypořádali se vším. Já bych tady neměl moc dlouho řečnit. Šedý vlas říká, že už jsem si toho zařečnil dost a ještě dneska tady budu vystupovat. Tak vlastně bych chtěl popřát našemu jednání hodně zdaru a myslím si, že skoro můžu slíbit i v téhle době, kdy se nedá nic slibovat napevno, že minimálně workshop orální historie na hradě Slovenci, který děláme zatím nepřetržitě, nezlomí ani pandemie, nebo jak jsem včera telefonoval s panem Kastelánem, i kdyby byly sebevětší distance, které nám ministr Blatný nařídí, což tady bývá 20, 30, 40 metrů, tak tam máme každý pro sebe 7 arů, což znamená, že 7 arů je dost, abychom tam pojili 100 lidí a nenadýchali se žádného viru. To je věc číslo 1. Věc číslo 2 je, že vlastně naše delegace tady doufejme, že pojede do Singapuru, myslím tím Lenku a Jiřího, a že už jsme se tady bavili, protože ta budova je tady krásná a zázemí snad také, že bychom chtěli zabojovat o příští mezinárodní konferenci COHA opět v Praze po 12 letech. Stále držíme ten nejlepší výsledek, což znamená přes více než 500 lidí a 55 států, což je docela dobrá výzva, abychom to tady překonali. Takže všem nám přeji, hodně vám pěkné příspěvky. Těm, kteří jsou bohužel někde mi skryti, tak ty hodně pozdravuji. Mějte se výborně a ať vám naše konference něco dá. Děkuju.
Děkuji Mirkovi a předal bych teď slovo kolegyni Janě Wohlmuth Markupové, člence výkonného výboru České asociace orální historie a současně tedy zástupkyně garanta navazujícího magisterského oboru tady na fakultě, která nám představí nebo udělá takové představení před samotným příspěvkem, za který jsme velice rádi, že na dálku, tedy alespoň online prostřednictvím, přednese přední orální historik italský Alessandro Portelli. Takže Jano, máš slovo.
Ano, tak dobré ráno, dobré dopoledne všem. Já moc děkuji za slovo, moc děkuji všem, kdo se k nám připojili, ať už fyzicky, anebo spíše z většiny asi distančně. My teď vlastně přejdeme z toho úvodního přivítání rovnou do toho následujícího panelu, který je opravdu jako velmi mimořádný. Nikoli pouze s ohledem na mimořádnou situaci celosvětovou pandemickou, ale i s ohledem na to, že vlastně jako záminku k němu nám dalo vydání prvního českého překladu knihy Alessandra Portelliho Smrt Luigiho Trastulliho a jiné příběhy. Ta kniha vyšla jako 10. svazek edice Orální historie a soudobé dějiny v Nakladatelství Karolinum, kterému bychom tady právě také v řadě děkovných řečí vlastně moc rádi poděkovali za to, že se této knihy ujali, že ji tak krásně připravili k vydání, že ji krásně přeložili a vyšla vlastně na podzim loňského roku. Jedná se o první překlad a jedná se tedy o knihu z této edice Orální historie a soudobé dějiny a myslím, že si můžeme být šťastní a hrdí, že tahle kniha vyšla právě v Karolínu a v takhle krásné podobě. Tedy děkujeme jmenovitě panu řediteli Valovi a nyní se samozřejmě dostáváme na rovinu, kdybychom ideálně měli mluvit dvojjazyčně, ale to asi nezvládnu. takže nyní si možná připijeme na knihu.
Už?
Nebo ještě ne?
Ještě
ne. Tím pádem se možná můžeme přesunout a představíme autora a budeme se už věnovat autorovi.
Okay.
Takže tato kniha.
Ty se přesun víc a já...
Ano.
Ty děláš knihu, jo?
So, good morning, Professor Portelli. Can you see us? Can you hear us? Yes. So now I will give just a short, brief introduction, and then we shall continue with Mirek and with your speech. So I don't think that Professor Portelli is somebody that we should really introduce, deeply, because I think his name is well known to all our students, to all our graduates, and to all colleagues who do oral history. It is also very difficult to do an introduction of Professor Portelli, because he is a scholar, oral historian, writer, and a musicologist whose work spans over many disciplines and areas of research. He is a professor of Anglo-American literature, affiliated with the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and he is also a prolific oral historian who had been invited to teach at many foreign universities like Princeton or Kentucky. A winner of prestigious awards for his work and moving spirit of Circolo, Gianni, Bosio, promoting research in folklore and people's culture. For us oral historians, Professor Portelli is also an author of crucial works symbolizing the cultural turn in oral history and establishing a profound theoretical framework, a new paradigm in which we had been for many years. His books, The Death of Luigi, Trastulli and Other Stories, The Order Has Been Carried Out, and They Say in Harlan County, represent just some of his texts, which had shaped the research practice of contemporary oral history. We are very proud that the first of these volumes is now finally available in Czech translation, almost 30 years after it was first published. We are certain that this will have an even deeper impact of his concepts in the practice of Czech oral history. But when we talk about Czech oral history on one hand, and Italian oral history, international oral history, and Alessandro Portelli, we should probably also ask how these two met, how these two came together. And there is probably nobody better that could give us an answer on this question than Professor Miroslav Vaněk. He has known Professor Portelli for a long time.
Like 20 decades.
You can talk to Professor Portelli here.
I don't see him. Hello, Sandro. Here. Okay. Like this one. Hello, Sandro. Great to see you. I see you there. For a long distance, to very bad for us that we couldn't meet personally in this difficult time. We planned to do it 2 times in autumn and now, but the situation. We are happy that we are able to publish your book at Karolinum Publishing House. Big congratulations to you. Big congratulations to us mainly, and big congratulations to director of the Karolinum. I love your death of Luigi Trastulli for 20 years. Maybe it's my first book which I read, but I would like to say that personally maybe I a little bit like more your book, The Say and Harlan County, probably because we could talk about the book for many hours when we little bit isolated in Bangalore for the winter school of oral history in India, and we spent the time in so small like garden and some apartment around among the bananas green and bananas trees and among the monkeys, and we can talk for many hours. I was proud that I get the chance to listen to you, and it was fascinating time for me. I still glad about our friendship, which is date for 20 years, and we met for first time I think at Sydney, maybe before. And actually I am very honored that I could little bit bring myself and write to conclusion on your excellent book. I would like toast, we bring something. It's a good start. But don't worry. I will toast the first Czech book, and we are waiting for another books, and I toast for your health, and I believe that situation COVID will improve in the autumn, and we will welcome you again in Prague.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, really. Well, it's a truly moving occasion for me to see old friends again. Of course, as he said, we go back many years, and in our conversations in Bangalore, I also learned a great deal about new ways and different forms of practicing oral history in different parts of the world, which I think is an approach that grew when he was president of the International Oral History Association. So thank you for this invitation, which comes sometime after my first encounter with the Czech oral history environment a few years ago in Prague. And even though it feels somewhat, should I say, chilly to be doing this kind of conversation online after so many years of spending time together and having the kind of informal exchanges that we have been talking about, that really are the space in which ideas are exchanged or traded back and forth. I have been following the International Oral History Network on COVID-19, on which I know that your organization has done such outstanding work. And one thing that everybody points out is how difficult it is for oral historians to conduct interviews online. Which is one reason why I have been working on a new project in Terni, which is a town of Luigi Trastulli, and somehow I wasn't able to carry it out because because I couldn't travel there, and I just didn't feel that online interviews were as productive as face-to-face encounters in which you can share the body language and the informal give and take of words and ideas. However, given the circumstances, it's a great privilege to be able to at least be part of your conference and your event, and congratulate you on the extraordinary growth of oral history in your country, which has had an impact internationally as well. And of course, the Czech translation of my Luigi Trastulli book is a truly thrilling event because, yes, I hadn't thought about it, but it's really been 30 years. Came out in 1991, and I remember how it originated. And it originated exactly in the kind of informal conversation that we've been talking about. Late 1980s, the International Oral History Conference was in Barcelona, and I was strolling on the square of the Generalitat of the government building in Barcelona, together with Michael Frisch, And Michael Frisch said, how about putting together, I'm starting a new series of public and oral history books with SUNY Press in Albany, New York, and how about putting together some of your essays to start that series? So it really began through this personal, informal kind of conversations and exchanges that we miss these days. Well, what about the book? The book has two aspects to this book. Well, one is, as you said before, the cultural turn in oral history. Well, I grew up in the 60s at a time when the student and social movements, the workers' movements in Italy, also had a powerful impact on the construction of rank and file culture, on culture from below, on the recognition of the history and meaning of the culture of working class people. And a lot of this took place around the folk revival movement. In Italy, the folk music revival was promoted by ethnomusicologists such as Roberto Levi, Diego Carpitella, but primarily in terms of organizations and public view by a social historian named Gianni Bosio, who we named our organization after him. And Gianni Bosio created this group, Nuovo Canzoniere Italiano, which revived the Italian folk music tradition as part of not just of musical entertainment, but of the new sources of the history of the working classes. What Bosio pointed out was, in order to write the history of the working classes, we need sources from the working classes. And in fact, he was also one of the first theorists in Italy of oral history. In fact, the turning point in all this political cultural development took place in Spoleto in central Italy in 1964. Spoleto was a seat of an international, very prestigious international cultural event, the Festival of Two Worlds. And one of the events in 1964 was a concert by the Nuovo Canzoniere Italiani. The concert ended up with the police breaking onto the stage and trying to arrest the musicians for performing anti-war songs from World War I and strike songs from the tradition of the Italian working class movement, of the radical left working class movements. I was fascinated by these stories, and meanwhile, because I had discovered folk music in the United States, I felt that maybe I ought to find out more about this Italian tradition, and I began going around trying to collect folk songs in Rome, in the working class neighborhoods of Rome, and in central Italy. And this is what led me to Terni. Terni is, but was much more in the 60s and 70s, a huge industrial center with an important set of steelworks, textiles, chemical factories. I had grown up there, but I had no working class connection, which tells you how separate the classes still were. When I went back, I discovered I discovered a group of traditional singers who were also political activists, who came from the anti-fascist guerrilla tradition, and who lived in rural surroundings but commuted to work in the steelworks. So they were sort of a convergence of working class, contemporary working class culture and the background of rural tradition, so that they were able to use their knowledge of traditional musical forms to express contemporary meanings, which in fact introduces a second aspect of the book, because meanwhile I have been discovering exactly the same kind of process in the United States, in Harlan County, Kentucky, where I was introduced to the history of Harlan County, which again was the seat of, still is in many ways, the seat of a militant fighting union tradition, the coal mines, but also one of the places where folk song, one of the hubs of working class folk song in the United States, the song that everybody knows in the labor movement and folk revival movement in the States, "Which Side Are You On?" was written in Harlan County in 1932. But what really struck me and made me think I have to go there and find out about it was when my friend Barbara Dane, who's a blues singer, she's now 93, and the New York Times has an article about her last week. She sang for me in her parlor another Harlan County song, "I Hate the Capitalist System." And I thought, look, I didn't realize that anybody had uttered these words in the United States. So that intrigued me, and I felt I had to find out more. So, in fact, the book is sort of a parallel between these two realities, these two working class realities, the steel workers in Terni, the coal miners in Harlem, and the ways in which these thriving, rich oral cultures derived from the rural background are able to deal and give voice to contemporary events and conditions. One example which in a nutshell summarizes the whole process is in a verse, a stornello. A stornello is a traditional form. It's a one verse rhyme that is often improvised. And in the countryside near Terni, I recorded a former shepherd who sang, his name was Pompilio Pileri, and I'd like to pay homage to him. And he sang this verse, which he had learned when he traveled with his sheep to the Roman Campagna, to the countryside around Rome, from the hills to the countryside. And he sang this verse that says, "I sleep among sheep and dogs to feed meat to the city folks in Rome." So this was shepherd's verse of city folks. And he came back, and of course, he played music, he sang. So he was part of this group of contemporary traditional singers. And one of them, Amerigo Matteucci, who was for 43 years the mayor of a small mountain hamlet near Terni, he sang the same verse, but he was a farm worker. And the way he sang it was, "I sleep among sheep and dogs to feed meat to the landlord." So this, just by changing one word, they had The verse told the story of the passage from animal husbandry, from the world of shepherds for sheep raising to farming. But then the other member of the group, Dante Bartolini, a steel worker and a great former partisan and a great traditional poet, he also sang the verse, but he sang, "I sleep among sheep and dogs to feed me to the bosses," meaning that he had introduced union language, factory words into this old shepherd verse. So just by changing one word, which is the way tradition works, osmotically, you don't necessarily have to create a new poem. You can just adapt a old poem to change conditions. And here you have the history of sheep raising, farm work, steel work in one verse. And what fascinated me was also that the poetics changed, because in the original version, "I sleep among sheep and dogs" was literal. In the second version, the farm work version, well, maybe yes, maybe not. In the factory version, it was metaphoric. So the social context and the poetics changed implicitly, and this was an extraordinary lesson in the meaning of in what tradition means. One thing that this group of working class anti-fascist singers always did, they wouldn't just sing a story, but they would they wouldn't just sing a song, but they would also tell the story behind the song. And a lot of these other songs they sang came from the resistance, the anti-fascist resistance, came from the union struggles, and so if they sang about the great partisan battle of the 9th of March, 1944, in Poggio Bustone, south of Denver, they also told the story of the battle. And if they sang the song of their iconic working class martyr, Luigi Trastulli, they also told the story of Luigi Trastulli. What makes, I guess the reason why this book, the article that I wrote on the history of Luigi Trastulli for a very small local activist, radical left journal on the death of Luigi Trastulli. The reason why it's being translated 40 years later, because that article came out in 1981, 40 years later in the Czech Republic, is that the story they told me was wrong. As most everybody knows, and I hate to repeat the story, but just to summarize it, Luigi Trastulli was a steel worker that was killed in a union demonstration against against NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, which the left at the time opposed. He was killed almost accidentally by a policeman who panicked and shot a volley and killed him. But the story that Dante Bartolini told me that day, and the story that Amerigo Matteucci told me, and the story that most people told, placed the killing of Luigi Trastulli in 1953, 4 years later, when the city erupted in rebellion against the firing of 3,000 workers from the factory. Now, I heard these stories around in the mid-70s, and I had really never heard the word oral history, and I didn't know anything about it. But because of Gianni Bosio's approach, Well, we were doing something other than what classic academic ethnomusicologists do. We weren't just out to collect the songs. We were out to collect everything. As I always said, the only teaching that I received in the practice of field work came the day in which Gianni Bosio delivered my first UR tape recorder to me, and he said, "Never turn it off." Which I think was quite a challenge because for a number of reasons I was paying my own for my own research, and so tapes were expensive, batteries were expensive, but never turn it off meant that we were not just interested in the songs, we were interested in the whole of the culture, of the cultures that we were trying to understand and to learn from. So that my tapes had as many stories as they had songs. And I'm sorry to say, I'm not a musicologist. I'm not even allowed to sing in the shower. The only thing I could do with the songs was to take them, archive them, try to collect, to read their social historical meaning, and then pass them on to musicians for performance and for musical study. At the time I was, however, beginning to teach literature, and therefore to develop my skills as an interpreter of narratives, which I had always truly been interested in. So I didn't know much about oral history. The first book, called Oral History in Italy, Luisa Passerini's collection of English and American oral histories. Luisa didn't know anything about Gianni Bosio and all the tradition I came from. It was a great encounter of two different traditions when Luisa and I finally met. But I wasn't aware of the fact that the main criticism that was being levied by historians toward oral history was, it's not reliable. You're not going to believe what old people tell you, are you? So I didn't know much about that. But because I was not a historian, but rather I had just turned into a professor of literature the same year in which I collected the first Trastulli stories. The question I asked was not so much, is it true or not? I knew it wasn't true. But the question I asked is a question that you ask not of any kind of narrative. What does it mean? And the meaning to me was precisely in the fact that it wasn't true. And of course, there wasn't just one person making a mistake, but more than half of the narratives that I collected made the same shift. So the question was, why? What does it mean? And I will not repeat the conclusions, but basically it had to do with events that took place not so much in the factory or in the streets or in the barricades, but that took place in the minds, in the subjectivities of the narrators and of the culture. So that the meaning of the narrative was precisely in the error. And I remember when I became aware of the sort of debate going on around oral sources, where the criticism was, memory is unreliable, these are only individual narratives, how do you how do you generalize the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee interferes with the authenticity of the narrative. And I had in mind a quote from Comrade Fidel Castro, who, when the great campaign to increase the production of sugar in Cuba failed miserably, he said, let us turn defeat into victory. And I said, I'll do that, I'll do exactly that. Well, he didn't turn defeat into history, but that's what he said. I'll do exactly that. I'll take the supposed liabilities of oral history and turn them into their power. Because of course we're still looking for factual credibility. We still want to find out what happened. We still work as historians. We didn't take the full, post-modern turn in which all the accounts of the text, there's nothing outside the text. No, there is. I mean, poor Luigi Trastulli was actually killed. Something does happen in the real world, and we are still interested in that. But what we have is something specific, something different. In a way, one of the responses that the first generation of oral historians gave to this criticism was, oral sources are as credible as all others. We just need to sift them out critically, just as we do with oral sources. And of course, historians like Cesare Germani in Italy, Paul Thompson, who came from sociology, it's an interesting thing, insisted on the reliability of the sources that they were working on. And this is absolutely important, and we should hold on to this. However, the shift in sensibility and in interpretation came from the fact that we went beyond the claim, some of the more naive claims that early oral historians made when they talked about oral histories give us access to the actual experience. Well, no, they don't give us access. You can never have access to somebody else's experience. What do we have? We don't even have the memory of the experience. We have a verbal construct, a dialogic verbal construct, which turns the memory of an experience into words that somebody else can understand. So all that we really have to hold on to are the words. Now, the expression oral history, there are two terms in oral history. And in the oral history community internationally, there is some of us are putting the weight on the word history. That is, we're using oral sources to do classic work, to find out about the past. Others, like me, who come from different fields, to me the word oral is at least as important as the word history. It means that while oral sources are about as useful as any other in reconstructing the events, because I don't believe that archival or written sources are more reliable than others. They're just different. The specific contribution of oral history is in the words, is in the construction of the narrative, and in the dialogue. because that's where the challenge of making sense of the experience, of making sense of the memory comes about. So that the shift between 1949 and 1953 was the result of the effort of the narrators to make sense of the past. And ultimately, the meaning had to do with two levels. One was what was on people's minds in those 4 years between the murder of Luigi Trastulli and the rebellion. And my reading of it is that the killing of Luigi Trastulli was not just an act of violence, but was also a loss of dignity, a loss of faith, because they were unable to respond. They were unable to punish the murderers. So that the rebellion in 1953 was a response also to that. People went to the barricades also to respond to the loss of pride caused by the unpunished murder of their comrade and friend. But one reason why conventional historical narratives had not recognized this connection was, on the one hand, they didn't have access to oral sources, they didn't pay any attention to the subjectivity of the people. And on the other hand, these were considered like two separate events. And in the minds of the narrators, it wasn't, between 1949 and 1953, it wasn't a set of individual events. A strike in 49, or a strike in 51, an election in 52, a rebellion. But it was, as someone that put it was a war. That is, it was one continuity. And which means that while the historical narrative tends to be diachronic, one event after the other, memory tends to be synchronic. That is, we all remember different times at the same time. The remembered events belong to different moments in time, but the act of remembering them is all contemporary. That is, memory is more like a space, and the connection between events is less in terms of cause and effect, sequence, rather than association, analogy, similarity, and synthesis. The same is the case with Harlan County. 1930s was a very dramatic time in the coal mines there. And if you read history books, traditional history books, there were at least 6 or 7 separate armed confrontations in which coal miners and deputy sheriffs shot it out, killed each other. 1931, 33, 37. So there were like 5 or 6 events that are still recalled as battles. But the way people talk about it is it was a war. There is a continuum rather than a set of separate events. And this is one of the things that we learn about memory. What we learn about memory is that the reason why many critics insist on the unreliability of memory is that memory is perceived as a deposit of data which are placed there, and then in time they deteriorate. This is not what memory is, or at least this is not what the way it works in the cases that I've been studying. Memory is a constant, is a sign of a constant activity of trying to make sense. In fact, I often said I prefer to talk about remembering rather than memory, of a verb rather than a noun, because it's constant work of making a remaking sense in which whether you remember something and how you remember it depends on what it means to you in the moment in which you remember. So one thing, this is one of the ways in which we turn a supposed liability into power. The criticism was you cannot rely on oral sources because they're not coeval, because of the time between the event and the telling. And to me, the fact that there's a time between the event and the telling is crucial, because it's in that time that people make sense of what happened. The excellent work that you've been doing in Prague on the pandemic is an extraordinary example of creating coeval sources. But to me, there's another dimension. That is, we will know what the pandemic means 30 years from now, 50 years from now, when memory has made sense of it. And there's a fantastic TV ad in Germany where it looks like an oral history interview to elderly people sitting in their parlor talking about when they were young, and when they were young was the time of the pandemic. So the supposed deterioration of memory is in fact a construction, a making sense of the past, just as the supposed interference of the interviewer is, number one, what makes the interview possible, because nobody tells the story of their lives in monologue without a listener. So in many ways, the encounter between the interviewer and the interviewee is an encounter between differences, cultural differences. The most important interview I think I ever made was in Harlan County with me, male, white, middle-class, European, lapsed Catholic, with a black female, working-class Baptist, union activist, coal-miner's wife, all the differences in the world. And it was a conversation across differences. And as I always say, speaking across is the original meaning of the word dialogue, which means exactly speaking across. So even when, even when children interview their grandparents, it's an intergenerational conversation. It's a conversation across generational differences. So that what comes, the supposed interference of the narrator in a supposed authenticity that doesn't exist, the interference of the interview, is really the challenge that a person that comes from one generation, one gender, one culture, poses to someone else to say, try to make your life understandable to me. And in order to make it understandable to me, you must make it understandable to yourself, which is a challenge that hardly ever we are offered. So, more or less to conclude, the other aspect of the book has to do precisely with this. With the meaning of narrative, and one chapter of which I'm especially fond, that It's not one of the more popular ones, perhaps because it's a bit too specific. It's a chapter on William Faulkner's book, Absalom, Absalom. Because Absalom, Absalom is a book about memory. And number one, what amazed me, what struck me was, well, the origin of that article was that in the teaching literature, I had often come across the distance between the classic books that we were teaching and the interests and the lives of the students, so that there was always an effort to teach books that were easier, closer to their interests, and it didn't work. It didn't work. So I decided one day to take the most difficult book I could think about, the most alien book I could think about, and William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom is a case in point. But and trying to teach that. And as I was working on it, I realized that it had a lot to do with what I was beginning to conceptualize in terms of oral history, because it's a book about memory. It's a book about memory in which events that take place between 1849 and 1866 are told and recollected and reconstructed in 1909. And it's a book about how the memory is created. And I realized that the procedure, the way in which the story is told is the narrator learns the story not because somebody sits down and tells it to him, but by piecing together fragments of conversations and narratives, anecdotes that he overhears that are not necessarily addressed to him. And I asked the students, isn't this how we all learn the history of our own families? It never happens that the grandfather, now that I'm a grandfather and I have a fireplace, it doesn't occur to me to pick up the granddaughter, put her on my knee and tell her, dear honey, I'm going to tell you the history of your life and of my life and of your family. It just doesn't happen that way. Memory doesn't pass, it's not transmitted that way. Memory is transmitted accidentally. And also, somehow memory has to deal with the fact that there's a refusal to listen. And the form in which memory is transmitted in that book is exactly in terms of incremental repetition. The narrator tells an anecdote as if to test the willingness of the other person to listen, and then retells the anecdote and enlarges it gradually a little bit until she finally wins the attention of the narrator, of the narrative. In my oral history interviewing, I had come across exactly the same episode. An old lady that I was interviewing for totally other reasons, introduced in the narrative, in her elements about her own life. I was interviewing her about her brother, and she kept talking about herself. I didn't realize at the time that this was a basic lesson in oral history. Because when we talk about testimony, we talk about the fact that somebody speaks about something else. Instead, in the oral history interview, the interviewee always speaks about herself. In the interviews about the Nazi massacres in Rome, people talked about their husbands killed in the massacre, but they mainly talked about their lives, their own lives. So it's not testimony, it's not a biography, it's narrative. So, and this lady interjected this anecdote, and I didn't listen, and then she came back to it and added more detail until finally the reason why I was doing the interview, which was her how her brother was involved in the underground anti-fascist in the 30s, has 2 lines in the book. But the history that she forced me to hear, which is a history of a tragic love affair, well, it takes a whole book, takes a whole chapter. And fascinatingly, the history she tells is exactly the same history that is told in Absalom, in the same form of incremental repetition, and even in the same time distance, 43 years. I always thought there was some kind of magic in that. So these are some of the themes that went into the making of that book, and that have become sort of the guide, steering lights in my work ever since. I find that like the Stornello about the sheep and the dogs, I keep saying the same thing. I've hardly said anything really new in the 40 years since I first heard the history of Luigi Trastulli. But I've been saying it always in different ways, adding details in the ways in which the Terni lady did to her anecdote, changing it because of different, because I'm talking to different people every time, and you don't tell the story in the same way to the same person, and also because you're not the same person, because I'm almost 50 years older than I was back then, and as Leslie Marmon-Silko says in her great book, Ceremony, Leslie Marmon-Silko is one of the great Native American writers. She says, well, the ceremonies have always been changing, even though the idea was that we would always do them in the same way, that they've always been changing, if nothing else because the skin on the drums becomes a little bit looser, because the voices of the singers becomes a little bit older. And so this ceremony, which to me is the almost holy narrative, founding narrative of the unavenged killing of Luigi Trastulli, is a ceremony that keeps changing. And it keeps changing, and I keep telling the story, because these are really my last words. You know, there's something they say in Rome which applies very much to me. It costs 5 cents to start him and 1,000 euros to stop him. But I will stop here. And with what is the basic reason for telling the story of Luigi Trastulli and other stories? Maxine Kingston, Chinese-American writer, in the book The Woman Warrior, says one of the ways in which the word revenge, it translates into Chinese, is tell the story to 5 families, spread the story of the crime. So in a way, telling and retelling the history of the killing of Luigi Trastulli is a way of making sense and revenging that crime. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture and for your speech. I think it was fascinating to hear the background of the book that we some of us already know, some of us don't, but probably will in a very short time. And I think now is the best time for questions from our audience or from our listeners and viewers on YouTube. So now is the time if anyone wants to ask Professor Portelli any question. You can send us your questions in Czech or in English on YouTube, or you can just say them out loud here. If Mirek wants to comment on something before anybody asks.
I'm not sure, but it was fascinating for me. I thinking about you and about your idea to have a tape recorder take off. We couldn't do it because we need a battery, we need to finish PhD, and we need sometimes finish our books too, that we cannot wait for when tape recorder be take off. But I have one question, because you are very famous. Your style of interviewing, that you put the tape recorder somewhere and record. The second one, which I very like, that you try to be so close to your narrators. And maybe I mistake, but you told about it in the book, they say in Highland County, about some church tradition with the snake holding. And my question is, if you use it to the same ritual, or just you only describe it? And if you can describe to this audience, because they don't know maybe about it, but it was like the highest point, how to be very close to next interviewers. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, number one, my experience is somewhat atypical, and in a way it allows for more purity, because basically I was never a professional oral historian, and this meant, number one, that I had to, that most of all my work has been self-financed. Unfortunately, I had my university salary and I could afford it, more or less. But also that I was free to follow my interest, and that I was not working on a project, and I was not working for an institution, which means that I was free somehow to, that was flexible in ways in which we all should be, but flexibility is sometimes a privilege. If you're writing a PhD dissertation and you've been assigned a topic, my original project in Germany was that I was trying to make sense of this 1949 to 1953 period. And then what happened was, the first interview I did, this lady talked about her great-grandfather, who was a member of the army of Giuseppe Garibaldi, the liberation of Italy. And I had enough freedom so that I could expand the book to cover, to begin in the 1830s, for one thing. And the other thing is, you use a word which is extremely problematic, finish. When is a whole history finished? And it really never is. So that not only did the original book cover 1831, 1985, so you always bring it to the present, because if it's a relationship between the present and the past, then you bring it to the present. So then I wrote another book on Terni, and then put them together, and it goes from 1831 to 2014. And I was working on another installment because between 2014 and 2020, the city has changed radically. It was a radical red town. It is now a radical right-wing town. So what happened? And if you don't bring it to the present, I mean, if I read my history, tell you where it is, it's a lie. I'm describing a town that no longer exists, you know. So, and I have been able to continue this process because I wasn't working for anyone, I was just working for myself. So, closeness to the snake handling. No, the closest I came to the snake handling was when, in one of the churches which I went, somebody came with a wooden box with some snakes in it. And the reason they do this is that in a literal interpretation of the gospel, which is part of the foundations of some of the folk traditional churches, especially in rural parts of the United States. There's a verse in the Gospel of Matthew where it says that you shall know my faithful, Jesus says, you shall know my faithful from these signs. And the signs are, they shall drink poison, they shall handle fire, and they shall handle snakes. They shall take up serpents. In fact, some of the most extreme practices in some of these churches, in states of trance, of altered consciousness, people do drink strychnine. People take up burning coals, but the most common practice is taking up of snakes, of serpents, which is a relatively modern thing. It came along precisely with the growth of coal mining. So it's a response to modernity. And why do they do this? Number one, these are poisonous snakes. These are poisonous snakes, copperheads, rattlesnakes. And apparently, look, it's a test of grace. That is, if you are able to handle the snake and not get hurt because you're a good follower of Christ. And if the snake bites you, there's something wrong with you. And they don't call the doctor. They don't go to the doctor. At least they're not supposed to. In many cases, they don't. This practice is outlawed in the state, say in Kentucky, but there's a great deal of tolerance because very often, as one of the preachers told me, the police themselves are snake handlers. My reading of it is more is different. That is, well, it has to do with, yes, you're close to the people and you go to snake handling churches, but your otherness means that you're still using your critical reading of what you see. And my reading is that the presence of death is the dominant element in those lives. Death from the coal mines, death in traffic accidents, death in a very high homicide rate, death from cancer, from so that handling the snake is in a way a way of handling death, being able to control death. I don't think people would go along with this interpretation of mine, because these things are so deep that probably you can only do it if you don't rationalize them. But in a way, so the closeness, you go to the church, and you know, they only pull the snakes out of the box if the spirit moves them. But so I wasn't sure whether I wanted the spirit to move them, but if I was more interested in the snakes or afraid of the snake, that didn't happen that time. So you go to the place where they handle the snakes, but you don't go there. Number one, I would not have handled the snakes, because you have to know how to do it anyway. And number two, I was reading their actions in ways different from the way in which they would have interpreted it. So you have a closeness, you're there, you accept them, and you have a distance. You offer an alternative interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a couple of questions to YouTube. The first one, maybe the girl will be better.
Yeah, I will read them because they are kind of a follow-up questions to what you were just saying.
Read them slowly because I don't hear you perfectly. So.
Okay, we will read slowly. So the question says, Dear Professor Portelli, you maintain that oral history is a never-ending process and oral sources are inexhaustible. This is a profound uncertainty. When was it for the first time that you realized?
Okay. This was one of the first things that I felt, because of course I realized that if you try to work on the memory of, say, 1953, well, there were like 10,000 people on those barricades, and I interviewed about 50. What about the other 9,550? Will you ever be able to interview them all? Of course not. Well, many of them are not even there anymore. And number two, if you interview somebody in 1972, are you sure that what he says in 1972 will be the same thing that he would say if you did it again 10 years later? I had the experience of doing interviews on the student movement of the 60s in Italy, and the interviews that we did in 78 are completely different from the interviews we did with the same kind of people in 2001. So it's really never-ending, because number one, it's supposed to, the number of people you should interview, you could interview, is endless, and because their lives are endless. So, because on the other hand, I do subscribe to the idea that in order to do any kind of research, we ought to have access to all the available sources. And oral history tells us, no, you can't do that. So that whatever you do is hypothetical, temporary, subject to revision. And this is one reason why history, not just oral history, but history itself is unchanged. Number one, because we keep discovering new documents. I mean, even if we only stick to the written record, we keep discovering. And number two, because we look at the same documents which change our look with different eyes as our history changes. So say the history of the Shoah was one thing, it was remembered in one way in 1960, and it's being remembered in a totally different way in 2021. And so oral history just draws attention to the temporary nature of all historical work, basically based on the fact that sources are inexhaustible and that the world of the historian and its and their audience keeps changing. So I think this is why I think oral history has helped us gain a more articulate understanding of historical work itself.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually, other questions started coming during the discussion, so we don't have much time to answer them all. But few of them are focused on, current young generation in Italy and what they think about the after-war times when the Communist Party in Italy was quite strong. So I don't know if you've probably captured some of these topics somewhere in written form, maybe already. If you can recommend to our students some of your texts or articles, books.
Well, again, it's a changing situation.
Yeah.
Right now we're in the process of celebrating or somehow remembering the 100 years from the foundation of the Italian Communist Party. It was founded in 1921. It may be difficult for people on the outside of Europe to make sense of the fact that the Italian Communist Party was the most important force in the Italian democracy, because not only because of the role it had in fighting fascism, but also because of the role it had in the writing of our constitution and in the bringing of masses and masses of people into a democratic form of life. For the contemporary generation, the Italian Communist Party dissolved in 1992. So they've grown up in a completely different world, and it's really part of their past. However, the fact that there is no actual political representation of working class people and of social movements is one of the reasons why there is such a lack of trust and faith in democracy today. Again, it may sound paradoxical, but there was never as much faith in democracy in Italy as when the Communist Party was strong, because it was part of it. So it's a different story. The other question is, there probably will not be time to answer all the questions.
Yeah.
Please tell people that they can email me.
Yeah, of course.
I'll do that.
There is maybe some last one, if you can say yes or no, maybe. There is a question, are there the connection of Italian oral history tradition with the work of Ernesto De Martino?
Okay.
But shortly, please.
Very good. Oh, I forgot to ask. I was never a member of the Italian Communist Party because I'm from the post-60s generation.
Yeah.
Well, Ernesto De Martino, two things. One is he was a great ethnologist, and but he was also a leader, an official of the Socialist Party. And when he investigated the archaic history, the death rituals, the world of magic in the South, he realized that this was not just something that belonged to another world. In a famous phrase, he says, those people are citizens of my own country, and they belong to the same history as I do. So he put the most archaic rural traditions in the context of people's history. And the other thing he did was that he was the first to identify such a thing as progressive folklore. Because folklore, even in the most naive readings of Gramsci, was something that had to do with remnants of the past. De Martino recognized that no, there was such a thing as progressive radical working class folklore. So that the institution that Gianni Bosio created was, and still exists, was named Istituto Ernesto De Martino. And my pupil Gianni Bosio is an offshoot of the Istituto De Martino. So he's one of the inspirations to that.
Many thanks, Alessandro.
Thank you.
It's a pity that we have to finish so good discussion, but I strongly believe that we will see in autumn. This year, we will invite you for 3-4 classes, and we are glad about it. And I hope that we will hear about your and other books and your ideas, maybe together to Corona and maybe different one. Many thanks.
Thank you, and have a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Tak a teď si dáme přestávku a budeme pokračovat dalším panelem
10 minut?
za 10 minut. Děkujeme za pozornost.